combination of factors led to the 1960s hippie movement, one of the most popular and well-known movements of history. When people think of the 1960s, you can almost guarantee peace and rock will come to mind. These were the two main factors that led to the emergence of the hippie movement. Rock music allowed for the expressions of emotions which brought feelings for peace and love to the surface. These feelings that were brought to the surface were felt by a mass amount of the country, a majority of whom were young, and caused an overall desire for peace and liberal change. So, rock music and the feelings for peace brought about from it were the primary factors of the hippie movement as known today. The intense divisions within the movement that began to become more visible by the end, along with the growth of drug abuse and the movement's overall loss of purity, led to its rapid demise. First, America's overall consensus for a peaceful world was another important factor of the hippie movement's emergence. The first place we see the late 60s hippie movement's root is in the war protest and basically the intense opposition to the Vietnam War. Alice Hers, for example, on March 16, 1965, an 82-year-old member of the Women's Strike for Peace set herself on fire in Detroit to dramatize her opposition. And this is but one instance where the not only widespread but intense movement for peace is seen. This, along with all the other countless and nameless acts made for a peaceful world, were a direct cause of the 1960s hippie movement. Another place the roots of the hippie movement are seen are the teach-ins that were commonly held in the beginning of the decade. During the Vietnam War, many teachers and students would have such teach-ins. At these, people would get together and have discussions about the war. From March 24th to March 25th, 1965, for example, the University of Michigan conducted a teach-in at which students and faculty took up the issue of war. The teach-ins had spread nationwide by the end of May. This peaceful process of spreading awareness of a specific movement was later adopted by the hippies who had love-ins. At love-ins, young people gathered by the tens of thousands to listen to rock and roll music expressing messages of love, harmony, and peace. The want for peace was a direct cause of the 1960s hippie movement. Not only were the approaches used in the early 1960s adopted later by the hippies, but their core goal for peace, too, was the heart of the whole hippie movement.
Okay, that was fine. Okay, what's the next one about?
Rock and roll music was another vital factor of the hippie movement's emergence. Rock was a connector as well as a gateway for those who wanted a peaceful world to unite behind their movement. People, black and white alike, got together to listen to music and talk about their emotions and desires for peace and harmony. Since the feelings were discussed and brought to the surface, the desire to live in a world that was simply peaceful became more apparent, and people found that they were not alone in wanting that. Popular songs that thousands upon thousands of people listened to were all about peace and love, further uniting those who wanted peace. Rock music not only gave people a way to share their feelings, but also spread the peace movement, since the famous singers that the young people admired wanted peace just like they did. In direct relation to the expression rock music allowed, the values of 1960s youth culture were personal freedom, political pacifism, and social optimism. These values were brought about and intensified by rock music. Had the hippies not had rock music to bring their feelings to the surface and connect with the others who wanted peace, there probably wouldn't have been such a wide-scale hippie movement. But rock music was there, and the hippies of the 60s did unite behind it. Therefore, rock music and its expression of emotions were a very large part of the hippie movement's emergence. I'll just whip myself in the face with my fucking string. This great movement, however, had to come to an end at some point. The intense divisions within the movement seemed to be the most important cause of its demise. There were many divisions, from the Democratic Party being split, the nation itself being split, and whites becoming tired with all the change, but there seems to be two main divisions that most directly led to the movement's collapse. First, the people involved in the movement itself were divided. By the end of the 1960s, some people thought of the counterculture as a political movement. Others saw it as a lifestyle revolution. Increasingly, the two views were at odds. On top of this, some people were just in it for fun, while others were actually serious about the movement and wanted real political change. As well, the hippie movement itself consisted of a broad coalition of many movements. As true as it was to its values of including anyone, this combination of movements proved to be a flaw. By the end of the decade, all the different specific movements were almost fighting against one another. The anti-war movement, the women's rights movement, and the struggles of gays and lesbians, Latinos, and other minority groups were increasingly competing for attention on the left. They sapped the strength of the youth movement, which grew more fragmented. These deep divisions weakened the movement, quickening its fall. Finally, at the end of the 60s, people began abusing drugs, and the movement had changed from having a noble purpose to not being a movement at all. What once was a true struggle to create a peaceful world turned into people simply doing drugs and having fun. The hippies had always used drugs, obviously. Drugs were just more abused and also more intense by the end of the decade. Initially, psychedelic drugs and weed were used to see yourself better, but the issue of attaining peace and spreading love were still there. This deteriorated when heavier drugs started being used. By 1969, marijuana and LSD had given way to more serious drugs, such as speed and heroin. Even at Woodstock, the quintessence of the hippie movement, people abused drugs on a wide scale. This abuse of drugs itself led to a loss of purity in the movement. Some people weren't even concerned with attaining peace. By the early 1970s, most young people had concluded that the counterculture was more about good times than about radical politics. Therefore, the hippie movement came and went. The intense desire for peace and expression of emotions in rock and roll had caused the movement. But by the end of the decade, the pure goals of living in a peaceful and harmonious world had gone away. The movement that had started with such a strong foundation and an overall united desire for peace deteriorated when that noble goal was compromised.